The echoing footsteps in the marble corridor of the Vatican fell silent as Captain Lorenzo Benedetti of the Swiss Guard knelt before Pope Leo XIV. His weathered hands trembled slightly as he presented a small, worn silver medal resting on a velvet cushion. The newly elected American Pope, Robert Francis Prevost, who had chosen the name Leo XIV just hours earlier, leaned forward, his eyes narrowing as he recognized the ancient military decoration. "Your Holiness," the guard captain whispered, his voice catching. This belonged to Private Marco Vincenzo, who served 3 popes before giving his life in the 1981 assassination attempt. His dying words were meant for the future of our church. Pope Leo XIV carefully lifted the medal, turning it over to read the inscription. The gathered cardinals watched as the color drained from the Holy Father's face. When he finally spoke, his words were barely audible, yet they seemed to fill the entire chapel. He wrote, "Remember why we serve, not for glory, but for what lies beyond the suffering." The Pope closed his eyes, a single tear tracking down his cheek. This young man understood something that I've spent a lifetime trying to grasp. The silence that followed was shattered only by the muffled sobs of an elderly nun who had served alongside Private Vincenzo. No one in that room would ever forget the words that Pope Leo XIV spoke next. Before we continue, if you enjoy stories of faith, courage, and unexpected moments of profound humanity, make sure to click that subscribe button. This is the best way for you to support our work. Thank you very much, and let's continue. The morning of Pope Leo XIV's election had begun like any other day in Vatican City, except for the palpable anticipation that hung in the air like incense. The papal conclave had been one of the shortest in modern history, just 2 days, resulting in the election of the first American pope. Cardinal Robert Francis Prevost, at 68 years old, had not been considered among the frontrunners by Vatican observers. Yet when the white smoke billowed from the Sistine Chapel chimney at 10:17 that morning, it was his name that Cardinal Giovanni Rossi announced to the crowd gathered in St. Peter's Square, "Habemus Papam, we have a pope." Cardinal Prevost had chosen the name Leo XIV, honoring Pope Leo XIII, whose encyclicals on social justice and workers' rights had profoundly influenced Prevost during his early years as a priest working in Chicago's impoverished South Side. The choice was symbolic of the direction he hoped to take the church, returning to its roots of caring for the marginalized while navigating the complexities of the modern world. As tradition dictated, after the election and his acceptance, Pope Leo XIV was led to the Room of Tears, a small chamber adjacent to the Sistine Chapel, where newly elected popes don the papal vestments for the first time and often experience the full weight of their new responsibilities. It was here, according to those present, that Captain Benedetti had requested a brief audience with the new Holy Father. The Swiss Guard, with their distinctive blue, red, and yellow Renaissance-era uniforms, had protected the popes for over 500 years. Captain Lorenzo Benedetti had served for 27 of those years, witnessing the transitions between 3 pontificates. A man of few words and unwavering loyalty, he had never before requested a private audience with a newly elected pope. "Your Holiness," Benedetti had said, bowing deeply, "I bring something that has been waiting for this day, something entrusted to the Guard by one of our own who believed it must be presented to you specifically." Pope Leo XIV, still adjusting to hearing himself addressed by his new title, had gestured for Benedetti to continue. The Swiss Guard captain produced a small wooden box, its surface worn smooth by time and handling. "This belonged to Private Marco Vincenzo," the captain explained. "He died protecting Pope John Paul II during the 1981 assassination attempt. Before he passed, he left specific instructions that have been honored and passed down through the commanders of the Guard." Pope Leo XIV's expression showed puzzlement. "Instructions concerning me, but that was over 40 years ago. I was just a young seminarian then." Captain Benedetti nodded solemnly. Private Vincenzo had a vision the night before the attempt. He described a future pope, American-born, with a background in both theology and social work, who would take the name Leo. He said this pope would face challenges unlike any before, and would need this reminder at the start of his pontificate. The Pope's hands trembled slightly as he accepted the box. Inside, nestled on faded red velvet, lay a papal Benemerenti medal, a decoration awarded by the Pope to members of the Swiss Guard and others for exceptional service. This one, however, was unlike any other. The silver surface was marred by what appeared to be a bullet hole, and etched on the back were words not typical of such medals. "This is the medal Pope John Paul II had intended to present to Vincenzo the very day of the assassination attempt," Benedetti explained quietly. When they found Vincenzo's body, this was clutched in his hand. Somehow in the chaos he had obtained it, and somehow he had managed to inscribe those words despite his injuries. Pope Leo XIV turned the medal over, reading aloud the roughly etched message. "Remember why we serve, not for glory but for what lies beyond the suffering." It was at this moment in the Room of Tears that the first tears of Leo XIV's pontificate were shed, not for the burden he was about to assume, but for the sacrifice of a young man who had died protecting the church he loved, having foreseen, in some mysterious way, this very day. Word of this encounter spread quickly through the Vatican, and by the time Pope Leo XIV had emerged onto the balcony of St. Peter's Basilica to deliver his first Urbi et Orbi blessing to the city and the world, the medal was pinned discreetly to his vestments, visible only to those who knew to look for it. Cardinal Francisco Gomez, who had been present in the Room of Tears, later recalled, "I have witnessed 3 papal elections in my lifetime, but I have never seen a man so thoroughly transformed in an instant as when Pope Leo read those words. It was as if Private Vincenzo was speaking directly to him across the decades." As the days of Pope Leo XIV's new pontificate unfolded, the story of Private Marco Vincenzo gradually came to light, pieced together from Vatican archives, Swiss guard records, and the memories of those who had known him. Marco Vincenzo had been born in a small village near Lugano, Switzerland in 1958. The son of a clockmaker and a schoolteacher, he had grown up with 2 passions, his Catholic faith and military history. As a child, he had been fascinated by the Swiss Guard, poring over books about their history and traditions. At 19, tall and disciplined, he had fulfilled his lifelong dream by joining their ranks. Those who served alongside him described a young man of unusual thoughtfulness and spiritual depth. In his sparse free time, he was often found in prayer in the small chapel reserved for the Guard, or studying theological texts that most of his comrades found impenetrable. "He wasn't like the rest of us," recalled retired Guard Josef Müller, now in his 70s. "We joined for duty, for honor, for the prestige of serving the Holy Father. Marco joined because he believed God had called him specifically to protect the Church in a time of crisis. He spoke about it with such conviction that none of us dared question him, even though some thought him strange." The night before the assassination attempt on May 13, 1981, Vincenzo had been unusually agitated. According to Guard records, he had requested an additional shift, insisting that he needed to be present during the Pope's public audience in St. Peter's Square. His commander, noting his exemplary service record, had granted the request despite the irregular nature of it. Sister Maria Consolata, now 93 years old and one of the few people still alive who had known Vincenzo personally, had encountered him that morning as he prepared for duty. "I remember it clearly," she said, her ancient hands folded in her lap as she spoke to Vatican Radio for a special broadcast about Pope Leo XIV's election. Marco was praying in the chapel, but it wasn't his usual peaceful prayer. He was almost wrestling with God like Jacob in the scriptures. When he saw me, he said something I've never forgotten. "Sister, sometimes God shows us what is coming, not so we can avoid it, but so we can embrace it with full awareness." Hours later, when Mehmet Ali Aka fired his gun at Pope John Paul II in St. Peter's Square, witness accounts had always been confused about exactly what happened in those chaotic moments. What was clear was that Private Vincenzo had broken protocol, moving before the shots were even fired, positioning himself in a way that security experts later said made no tactical sense unless he had somehow known what was about to happen. Vincenzo sustained 3 gunshot wounds. While the Pope was rushed to the hospital, Vincenzo, knowing his injuries were fatal, had asked to be taken to a small side chapel instead of going immediately to the hospital. There, a priest administered last rites, and Vincenzo, with his remaining strength, apparently used his own blood to etch his message onto the medal that had been scheduled to be presented to him that very day for 3 years of exemplary service. The medal had then been passed from one Swiss Guard commander to the next, with Vincenzo's unusual instructions that it be presented to a future American Pope who would take the name Leo, a man who would have worked extensively with the poor before being called to the chair of St. Peter. For 43 years the medal had waited, its existence known only to a handful of people within the Vatican. Some had dismissed Vincenzo's vision as the hallucinations of a dying man. Others had kept faith that someday his prophecy would be fulfilled. And now, as Pope Leo XIV sat in his private study a week after his election, the medal rested on his desk as he reviewed the dossiers of global crises that demanded the Church's attention: wars in multiple regions, a refugee crisis of unprecedented scale, growing religious persecution in dozens of countries, economic disparities reaching breaking points, and environmental disasters becoming increasingly common. "You knew, didn't you, Marco?" The Pope whispered to the empty room, his finger tracing the bullet hole in the medal. "You knew what was coming." A knock at the door interrupted his contemplation. His secretary, Monsignor James O'Connor, entered with a stack of papers requiring immediate attention. "The representatives from the United Nations are waiting, Your Holiness," O'Connor said gently. "And after them, the delegation from the International Monetary Fund. Cardinal Santos has also requested a moment of your time regarding the situation in the Philippines." Pope Leo XIV nodded, rising from his chair. He slipped the medal into his pocket, feeling its weight, far heavier than its few grams of silver would suggest. "Tell them I'll be there shortly, James." As Monsignor O'Connor turned to leave, the Pope added, "And could you arrange for me to meet with the current members of the Swiss Guard tomorrow? All of them, not just the officers." O'Connor raised an eyebrow, but nodded. "Of course, Your Holiness." The next morning, in an unprecedented move, Pope Leo XIV addressed the full contingent of the Swiss Guard in their barracks, the first time in living memory that a pope had come to them rather than summoning them to him. The 135 guardsmen stood at attention, their expressions reflecting varying degrees of surprise and curiosity. "At ease, gentlemen," the Pope said, his voice warm and conversational. "I've come to thank you for your service, but also to share something with you that I believe belongs not just to me, but to all of you." He proceeded to tell them the story of Private Marco Vincenzo and the medal, holding it up for all to see. Many of the older guardsmen had heard whispers of the story, but for most this was entirely new information. Vincenzo understood something profound about service, Pope Leo continued, walking slowly among the ranks of guardsmen. He wrote, "Remember why we serve, not for glory, but for what lies beyond the suffering." I've been reflecting on these words since my election, and I believe they speak not just to the Swiss Guard, but to the entire Church in our time. Captain Benedetti, standing at attention at the front of the formation, felt a lump forming in his throat. For 27 years, he had safeguarded Vincenzo's medal and his story, sometimes wondering if he was preserving nothing more than a curious legend. Now, seeing the new Pope speaking Vincenzo's words to a new generation of guardsmen, he felt a circle closing, a promise fulfilled. "The world is facing crises on multiple fronts," Pope Leo continued. "Many people look to Rome for answers, for hope, for leadership. The easy path would be to retreat behind these walls, to preserve what we have, to speak only in generalities that offend no one and challenge no one. But that is not why Vincenzo gave his life. That is not why you stand guard day and night. And that is not why God has called me, the most unlikely of candidates, to this office." He held up the medal again, sunlight from the windows catching the silver surface. "This medal reminds me that our service is not about us. It's about what lies beyond the immediate challenges, beyond the suffering that service often entails. It's about a kingdom not of this world, yet one that must begin in this world through our actions and choices. The silence in the barracks was complete, every man present sensing that they were witnessing something historic. Pope Leo XIV continued, his voice growing stronger. Starting today, I am establishing the Vincenzo Initiative. Each year, one member of the Swiss Guard will be selected to accompany me on pastoral visits to areas of conflict, poverty, and crisis around the world. You will not come as my security, local arrangements will be made for that, but as my witness and as representatives of this ancient core that stands at the heart of our church. A murmur ran through the ranks, quickly silenced by a sharp look from Captain Benedetti. Additionally, the Pope continued, I am asking the Swiss Guard to establish a humanitarian arm, volunteers from your ranks, past and present, who can deploy to disaster areas and refugee camps, bringing not just physical aid, but the spiritual presence of the Church to those in greatest need. He paused, looking around at the faces of the young men surrounding him. Some will say this is not your role, that it dilutes your historic mission. I disagree. Your mission has always been to protect the Church, and the Church is not these buildings, nor even the office of the Pope. The Church is the people of God, particularly those suffering and in need. Pope Leo XIV held up Vincenzo's medal one last time. This bullet hole reminds us that sometimes protection requires sacrifice. Sometimes it requires us to place ourselves where we are most needed, even when that place is dangerous. Sometimes it requires us to rethink what protection truly means. As he concluded his address, Pope Leo asked the guardsmen to join him in prayer for Private Vincenzo's soul and for the wisdom to carry forward his understanding of service in their own time. The scene, the Pope praying surrounded by the colorful ranks of the Swiss Guard in their ancient barracks, was captured by a Vatican photographer. The image would later become one of the most iconic of Pope Leo XIV's early pontificate, symbolizing both tradition and transformation. What none of the guardsmen knew that morning was that Pope Leo had already scheduled his first pastoral visit under the new Vincenzo Initiative. 3 days later, Vatican radio announced that the Pope would be traveling to South Sudan, a nation torn by civil war and facing a severe food crisis. The announcement noted that, in addition to the usual papal entourage, he would be accompanied by Corporal Gabriel Roth of the Swiss Guard, selected for his background in refugee assistance before joining the Guard. Global media seized on the story, particularly the connection to Private Vincenzo's prediction decades earlier. Some outlets treated it as a curiosity, others as evidence of divine providence. Vatican observers noted that beginning his international travels with South Sudan, rather than with traditional diplomatic visits to European capitals or major Catholic countries, sent a clear message about Pope Leo XIV's priorities. Cardinal Rossi, the Dean of the College of Cardinals who had announced Habemus Papam from the balcony just days earlier, expressed concerns privately to several colleagues. This American Pope moves too quickly, he was reported to have said. He does not understand that the Church thinks in centuries, not in news cycles. This Vincenzo Initiative may make good headlines, but it risks trivializing the Swiss Guard and creating security nightmares. When these comments eventually reached Pope Leo, his response was characteristically direct. Tell Cardinal Rossi that I think not in news cycles nor in centuries, but in souls. And souls cannot wait while we deliberate. The trip to South Sudan proceeded despite security concerns and logistical challenges. Pope Leo XIV and Corporal Roth visited refugee camps, hospitals, and remote villages where few international visitors ever ventured. Images of the Pope washing the feet of orphaned children, embracing elderly refugees, and praying alongside local imams for peace went viral on social media platforms worldwide. But it was what happened on the third day of the visit that truly captured global attention and brought the story of Private Vincenzo full circle. The papal entourage had traveled to a remote area near the Ethiopian border, where thousands of displaced persons had gathered in makeshift shelters. As Pope Leo moved through the camp, a sudden commotion erupted at its perimeter. Security personnel, reported that armed militants had been spotted approaching the camp. Standard protocol would have immediately evacuated the Pope to his helicopter. Instead, in the confusion, eyewitnesses reported seeing Pope Leo XIV remove the Vincenzo medal from his pocket, look at it briefly, and then turn to Corporal Roth. "Marco knew what to do," the Pope reportedly said. "Do we?" What followed was unprecedented. Rather than evacuating, Pope Leo asked to be taken toward the camp's edge, closer to where the militants had been spotted. Against the desperate objections of his security team, he approached a group of camp elders who had gathered to discuss their response to the threat. "If they come to all of us," the Pope was heard saying. "I will not leave you to face this alone." Corporal Roth, honoring his role in the Vincenzo initiative, stayed at the Pope's side, his ceremonial sword, normally just a symbol, now clutched with practical intent. For 2 tense hours, the situation remained uncertain. Reports varied about the militants' intentions and numbers. Some camp residents fled deeper into the settlement, while others gathered around the Pope, creating an impromptu prayer circle that gradually grew to include hundreds of people: Catholics, Protestants, Muslims, and those of traditional African faiths, all praying according to their own traditions, but united in their immediate concern. When the militants finally appeared at the camp's edge, they were fewer in number than feared. Just 7 young men with aging weapons. They stopped, visibly confused by the scene before them. Not panic, not military resistance, but a large circle of people in prayer, with a white-robed figure at its center. The Pope, seeing their arrival, did something that security experts would later condemn as reckless, but that those present described as transformative. He walked toward them, alone except for Corporal Roth, who stayed 1 step behind him. "We have food and medicine to share," Pope Leo called out in English, which was then translated by a local priest. "We have prayers to offer. We have no enemies here today." The young militants, most appearing to be teenagers, conferred among themselves. Their leader, a scarred man perhaps in his early 20s, approached cautiously. What transpired in the conversation that followed has been recounted in various ways. What is not disputed is that 30 minutes later, the militants had laid down their weapons and joined the gathering. By evening, they were sharing a meal with the Pope and camp elders, discussing the grievances and hardships that had led them to take up arms in the first place. "I saw the bullet hole in his medal," the militant leader, later identified as Joseph Mabia, told journalists. "When I asked about it, he told me the story of this guard who died protecting a pope long ago. He said sometimes the greatest protection is not a weapon, but a willingness to listen, to share in suffering, to recognize our common humanity." Mabia's group eventually agreed to help establish a local peace committee, working with both government forces and other militant factions in the region. While this represented only a small breakthrough in South Sudan's complex conflicts, its symbolic importance was enormous. When Pope Leo XIV returned to Rome, the story of the encounter, already being called the miracle of the medal in some quarters, had preceded him. He found both acclaim and criticism waiting. Security experts and some Curia officials condemned his actions as dangerous and irresponsible. Humanitarian organizations and peace activists hailed them as powerful, practical demonstrations of the gospel message. Captain Benedetti of the Swiss Guard requested a private audience the day after the Pope's return. When admitted to the papal study, he found Pope Leo looking tired but peaceful, the Vincenzo medal once again resting on his desk. "Your Holiness," Benedetti began formally, "as captain of the guard tasked with your security, I must respectfully express my profound concerns about the events in South Sudan. Your life was placed at unnecessary risk. Corporal Roth, while brave, was not equipped to protect you in such a situation." Pope Leo listened patiently, then gestured for Benedetti to sit, an unusual informality that momentarily flustered the disciplined guardsman. "Lorenzo," the Pope said, using the captain's first name, "do you know why I believe Marco Vincenzo foresaw my pontificate specifically?" Benedetti shook his head, still uncomfortable with being seated in the Pope's presence, but complying with the request. "Because we stand at a moment when the Church must decide what protection truly means in our world. Is it walls and protocols and distance from danger? Or is it presence, vulnerability, and shared risk with those who have no escape from their suffering? The Pope picked up the medal, turning it so the bullet hole caught the light from the window. This is not just about a God who gave his life decades ago. It's about what the Church is called to be in a broken world. Marco understood that. I'm still learning it. Benedetti found himself unexpectedly moved. The men talk of nothing else, Your Holiness, he admitted. Vincenzo has become a hero to them again, and Corporal Roth returns to a barracks full of guardsmen who now see their service differently. Applications to join the Guard have tripled since the story broke. Pope Leo XIV smiled. And what do you think, Captain? You've protected 3 popes with distinction. Is this old American upending everything you've worked for? The question was asked lightly, but Benedetti recognized its seriousness. He considered his answer carefully. My father served in the Guard before me, he said slowly. He once told me that the most important person he protected wasn't a pope at all, but a young mother and her children who were caught in St. Peter's Square during a demonstration that turned violent in the 1970s. He said that day he understood why the Guard exists, not just to protect one man, but what that man represents, God's love extended to all people. Benedetti paused, then continued with growing conviction. I believe Vincenzo understood this, and I believe, Your Holiness, that while your methods may challenge us, your message does not. It calls us back to our deepest purpose. The Pope nodded, visibly moved by the captain's words. Then, help me, Lorenzo. Help me shape this Vincenzo initiative so that it honors both prudence and courage, both tradition and innovation. The world needs both, perhaps now more than ever. That conversation marked the beginning of an unexpected partnership. Over the coming months, Captain Benedetti worked closely with Pope Leo XIV to develop protocols for the Vincenzo initiative that balanced security concerns with the Pope's vision for a more engaged, present church in the world's most troubled regions. The Swiss Guard established its humanitarian volunteer corps, drawing on the skills many guardsmen had developed before joining, everything from medical training to engineering to conflict resolution. Retired guardsmen too offered their services, creating a network that extended the Guard's ethos of service beyond the Vatican walls. Each month, Pope Leo XIV would gather with the guardsmen selected for Vincenzo initiative missions, praying with them and sharing reflections on Vincenzo's final message. Remember why we serve, not for glory, but for what lies beyond the suffering. As these efforts unfolded, researchers in the Vatican secret archives made a discovery that added yet another dimension to the story. Among papers related to the 1981 assassination attempt, they found a sealed envelope marked with instructions that it be opened only after an American pope had been elected. Inside was a handwritten letter from Private Marco Vincenzo, apparently written the night before he died. The letter read, in part, To the American Pope, who will be called Leo, if you are reading this, then what I saw in prayer last night has come to pass. I do not know your name or face, only that you will come at a time when the world faces darkness on many fronts, and that you will have walked among the poor before ascending to the chair of Peter. The medal that accompanies this letter bears the mark of my sacrifice, which is nothing compared to our Lord's. I give it to you not as a morbid relic, but as a reminder that our church has always advanced not through power, but through loving sacrifice. What lies beyond suffering is resurrection, both our Lord's and the continual resurrection of hope in our world, wherever the church fulfills its true mission. The Swiss Guard's motto is Acriter et fideliter, fiercely and faithfully. We have always understood the fiercely part. Now it is time to deepen our understanding of faithfully. You will face opposition from those who mistake preservation for protection. Stand firm. The church is not called to survive, but to serve. In serving, it will more than survive, it will bring life. I go tomorrow to my duty with a peaceful heart, knowing that decades from now, you will carry forward what God has revealed. The medal is yours now. May it remind you daily that no sacrifice in service to love is ever wasted. In Christ, Marco Vincenzo. When this letter was presented to Pope Leo XIV, he received it in silence, reading it multiple times before speaking. Those present reported that he finally looked up with tears in his eyes and said simply, "He knew me better than I know myself." The letter was published in L'Osservatore Romano, the Vatican newspaper, accompanied by an article about the growing impact of the Vincenzo initiative. By this time, Swiss Guard volunteers had participated in relief efforts following an earthquake in Indonesia, helped establish a medical clinic in a Venezuelan slum, and worked with local Catholic organizations to create dialogue between opposing factions in several African conflicts. Pope Leo XIV himself continued his pattern of prioritizing visits to areas of conflict and need, always accompanied by members of the Swiss Guard selected for the Vincenzo initiative. These visits were characterized by the same approach he had demonstrated in South Sudan, refusing to remain in secure compounds, insisting on direct contact with local people, and often bringing together opposing leaders for dialogue in his presence. A year into his pontificate, as Pope Leo XIV prepared for a Christmas address to the diplomatic corps accredited to the Holy See, he asked Captain Benedetti to stand beside him, an unprecedented honor for a Swiss Guard. The Vincenzo Medal, now mounted in a simple frame, was displayed prominently on the lectern. "Distinguished ambassadors," the Pope began, "as we gather to celebrate the birth of the Prince of Peace, I wish to reflect on what true peace requires of us. A year ago, I was presented with this medal bearing the message of a young Swiss Guard who gave his life protecting my predecessor. His words, 'Remember why we serve, not for glory, but for what lies beyond the suffering,' have become the cornerstone of my pontificate." The Pope gestured to Captain Benedetti at his side. The Swiss Guard, for 5 centuries represented by men like Captain Benedetti, has shown us that protection is not merely about physical security, but about preserving what is most precious: human dignity, compassion, and hope. Through the Vincenzo initiative, they now extend this understanding of protection to some of the most vulnerable people on Earth. He continued, addressing the assembled diplomats with increasing passion. "I call upon each nation represented here to consider, what does true protection of your people require? Is it only strong borders and military might? Or is it also the protection of human dignity, the environment that sustains us, the values that unite us across our differences?" By the conclusion of his address, Pope Leo XIV had issued specific challenges to the international community regarding refugee policies, climate action, economic justice, and conflict resolution. Many diplomats shifted uncomfortably in their seats, recognizing direct challenges to their government's policies. Others appeared moved, some even openly emotional. The Russian ambassador, whose government had been specifically challenged regarding its role in several ongoing conflicts, approached Pope Leo after the address. Observers tensed, expecting a diplomatic confrontation. Instead, they witnessed a remarkable exchange. "Your Holiness," the ambassador said, loud enough to be heard by those nearby, "my government will not appreciate much of what you said today." The Pope nodded solemnly. "I understand. Truth is often difficult to hear. But I have a son," the ambassador continued, his voice dropping slightly, "who serves in our military. 2 months ago, he was wounded in action. While recovering in hospital, he saw a report about your Vincenzo initiative and this medal. He wrote to me that it changed how he understands his own service and sacrifice." The diplomat paused, then added quietly, "He asked me to thank you, even if officially I cannot." That evening, in his private chapel, Pope Leo XIV placed the Vincenzo medal on the altar as he celebrated a mass attended only by Captain Benedetti and a few close aides. In his brief homily, he reflected on how a single act of sacrifice, a single message etched in desperate circumstances, could continue to bear fruit decades later. Marco Vincenzo could not have known all that would flow from his sacrifice and his words, the Pope said. He acted in faith, trusting that what lay beyond his suffering would be resurrection, not just for himself but for the church he served. Each of us is called to similar faith, to believe that our acts of service, seen or unseen, recognized or forgotten, contribute to the unfolding of God's kingdom. After the Mass, Pope Leo asked to be left alone in the chapel for private prayer. Captain Benedetti stationed himself outside the door, maintaining the ancient tradition of the Swiss Guard's protection. Hours passed. When the Pope finally emerged, he carried the Vincenzo medal in his hand. "Lorenzo," he said to Benedetti, "I believe it's time for this medal to continue its journey." The captain raised an eyebrow questioningly. "Tomorrow," the Pope continued, "when the new Vincenzo Initiative volunteers are commissioned, I want this medal to accompany them, not to remain here with me. Marco's message was never meant to stay within these walls. It belongs wherever our people serve." And so the next day, in a ceremony in St. Peter's Basilica, Pope Leo XIV presented the Vincenzo medal to the departing volunteers, 3 Swiss guardsmen heading to a refugee camp in Lebanon. The medal would travel with each Vincenzo Initiative mission from that point forward, a tangible reminder of the message that had ignited a transformation within the ancient core, and increasingly within the Church itself. As the medal was passed from the Pope's hands to those of the lead volunteer, a shaft of sunlight broke through the basilica's windows, illuminating the silver surface and the bullet hole that marred it. Many present would later describe it as a divine affirmation, a moment when heaven itself seemed to acknowledge the continuing significance of Private Vincenzo's sacrifice and message. Pope Leo XIV's voice carried clearly through the vast space as he commissioned the volunteers, "Go not as conquerors or even as saviors, but as servants. Remember why we serve, not for glory, but for what lies beyond the suffering, the resurrection of hope, the triumph of love, the kingdom of God breaking into our broken world." The assembled congregation, which included diplomats, Vatican officials, the full contingent of the Swiss Guard, and pilgrims from around the world, responded with sustained applause that echoed through the ancient basilica, applause not just for the departing volunteers, but for a vision of service that was transforming one of the world's oldest institutions from within. As Captain Benedetti watched from his position beside the papal throne, he reflected on how dramatically things had changed in the year since he had presented the Vincenzo medal to the newly elected Pope. What had begun as the fulfillment of an ancient promise had become something far more profound, a reimagining of what it meant to protect and serve in a wounded world. Sister Maria Consolata, the elderly nun who had known Marco Vincenzo personally, was present in a wheelchair near the front of the basilica. As the ceremony concluded, Pope Leo XIV made his way to her, kneeling beside her chair to speak with her privately. "He would be so proud," she was heard to say, her ancient hand trembling as she touched the Pope's cheek in a gesture of maternal affection. Not of the attention or the initiatives bearing his name, but of how his message has opened hearts. The Pope nodded, taking her frail hand in his. "When I prayed last night, sister, I felt his presence, not as a saint to be venerated, though perhaps someday the Church will consider that, but as a brother who understood something I am still learning, that our greatest protection is not our walls, but our willingness to risk everything for love." As Pope Leo XIV rose and processed out of the basilica, the assembled Swiss Guard snapped to attention, their halberds gleaming in the light. Among them were men who had already served in the Vincenzo Initiative and returned, changed by the experience. Their eyes reflected not just the traditional pride of their ancient core, but a deeper understanding of their service, an understanding captured in the words of a young guardsman who had died decades before many of them were born. Outside, in St. Peter's Square, thousands had gathered to witness the ceremony on large screens. As the Pope appeared on the basilica steps, a spontaneous cheer erupted, echoing across the plaza and beyond, into a world that was beginning to take note of a message, etched in silver by a dying man's hand. Remember why we serve, not for glory, but for what lies beyond the suffering. The Vincenzo medal continues its journey today, traveling with Swiss Guard volunteers to places of suffering and need around the world. It has been held by refugees, blessed by leaders of other faiths, dropped and recovered in disaster zones, and even briefly stolen, and then voluntarily returned by someone who claimed its message had changed their heart. Pope Leo XIV, reflecting on the medal's journey on the second anniversary of his election, observed, "The most powerful relics are not those we keep locked away, but those we allow to touch and transform lives. Marco Vincenzo's medal has become such a relic, not because of whose hands it passed through, but because of the truth it carries. Captain Lorenzo Benedetti, who had first presented the medal to Pope Leo XIV, retired from active service after 30 years with the Swiss Guard. At his retirement ceremony, he was named the first director of the Vincenzo Initiative, responsible for coordinating the Guard's humanitarian missions worldwide. "When I joined the Guard as a young man," Benedetti said in his acceptance speech, "I understood protection in terms of protocols, weapons, and physical barriers. Today, I understand it as Marco Vincenzo did, as a willingness to place oneself where suffering is greatest, to stand alongside those who cannot escape their circumstances, to serve not for recognition, but for what lies beyond, the kingdom that is both coming and already among us." The story of Private Marco Vincenzo, his prophetic vision, and the medal that connected his sacrifice to a pontificate decades later has become one of the most widely told narratives of modern Catholicism. It is recounted not only in Vatican circles but in refugee camps, hospital wards, conflict zones, and disaster areas, where the presence of Swiss Guard volunteers serves as a tangible reminder of the Church's commitment to being present in places of greatest need. Pope Leo XIV, when asked by a journalist if he ever regretted the risk he took in South Sudan by approaching armed militants rather than evacuating, replied with characteristic directness, "The only regret I have is that it took me nearly 70 years and a bullet-pierced medal to fully understand what Jesus meant when he said, 'Greater love has no one than this, to lay down one's life for one's friends.'" Marco Vincenzo understood this at 23. He is still teaching me, teaching all of us what it truly means to protect and serve. As each new class of Swiss Guard recruits takes their oath of service on May 6th each year, they now receive a small replica of the Vincenzo medal, engraved with his famous words. It serves as a reminder that while their ceremonial uniforms and ancient halberds connect them to 5 centuries of tradition, their true purpose transcends the walls they guard. And so, the legacy of a young guardsman who died protecting a pope in 1981 continues to transform the Church he loved, guided by an American pope who took the name Leo and who understood, as Vincenzo had foreseen, that true protection is not about security protocols and distance from danger, but about presence, vulnerability, and shared risk with those who suffer. In the final analysis, perhaps the most remarkable aspect of this story is not the seemingly miraculous connection across decades between a dying Swiss Guard and a future pope, nor even the institutional transformations that followed. Perhaps what touches hearts most deeply is the simple truth captured in Vincenzo's dying message, a truth that resonates far beyond the Catholic Church, speaking to all who seek to serve others in our broken world. Remember why we serve, not for glory, but for what lies beyond the suffering. For in those words lies an invitation that transcends religious boundaries and speaks to the deepest human longing, to know that our sacrifices matter, that our service has meaning, and that beyond the inevitable suffering of this world lies something worth giving everything for, the possibility of transformation, healing, and love breaking through even the darkest circumstances. As Pope Leo XIV said in his Christmas homily in the 3rd year of his pontificate, with the Vincenzo medal displayed beside the altar, Marco's message reminds us that Christianity has never advanced through power or privilege, but through loving sacrifice. The Swiss Guard has always understood sacrifice. What Marco helped us remember is the love that must motivate it. Love not just for an institution or an office, but for a world God so loved that he gave his only Son. That, in the end, is why the story of a Swiss Guard, a medal, and a pope continues to break hearts open. Not to despair, but to greater hope and deeper commitment to serving not for glory, but for what lies beyond the suffering, the kingdom of God breaking into our wounded world through acts of courageous love.